Election is important. We know in our bones this one is more consequential.
And this is the most important election in the history of our country.
From Bloomberg QuickTake, I'm Madison Mills. I'm so sorry, I'm in New York City here, folks, so we're getting a little buzz at the door. But today we are talking about the importance of climate change and its impact on the 2020 election. Between the president having coronavirus, protests over racial injustice, and wildfires raging across the West Coast, there's a lot going on. But we're going to zero in on climate change today and talk about how it might impact voters when they cast their vote on Election Day. Joining us to discuss this and more is Jillian Goodman, a reporter for Bloomberg Green, and Cara Horowitz, the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA. Thank you for joining us. To start off, Cara, I want to go to you. Of course, one of the major changes is the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, leaving a spot open on the Supreme Court. Can you talk about how that spot might impact the future of climate legislation in the U.S.?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And thanks so much for thinking about the election from this angle. I think it's critically important. The death of Justice Ginsburg has really highlighted the importance of the Supreme Court for lots of issues that are critical for this election, and climate change is just one of them. The role of administrative agencies in regulating climate change is critical. Agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and others play a really important role when the government tries to get a handle on a problem like climate change. And the truth is, with a 6-3 Supreme Court and a right-leaning judiciary, the court and the judiciary more generally are likely to become more skeptical of agency authority. What does that mean for climate change? It means that if Congress, after the election, tries to enact new legislation that's more aggressive in trying to control climate change, it may face a more skeptical court in its attempt to rein in this problem. If a Biden administration tries to use EPA or other federal agencies to more aggressively regulate climate pollution, again, those efforts might face a more skeptical Supreme Court. So everything just becomes more difficult with the 6-3 court in climate change if what you're trying to do is regulate climate pollution.
And Jillian, going to you, can you talk about how the changes Cara might could impact voters on Election Day?
I mean, I'm not a scholar of the Supreme Court or even a scholar of elections, so it's hard for me to talk about what voters might or might not do with this in mind. We do know that this has been a particularly salient issue for populations of color. I mean, in your introduction, you talked about protests over racial injustice, and this is fundamentally integrated with the environment and climate change. You look at communities of color are much more likely to be impacted by pollution. They're also more likely to be impacted by climate change, rising heat, rising sea levels, et cetera. They're also more likely to vote based on climate change. They're more likely to be concerned about climate change, polls show. And so, engaging that community is really important when we're talking about trying to get people to vote in leaders who are going to be mindful of climate change in the future.
And Jillian, you bring up the importance of the impact of climate change on communities of color. Cara, I'm wondering if you have anything else to add to that.
Well, Jillian is exactly right. Climate change is an inequality multiplier. What I mean by that is it's the most vulnerable communities that are impacted earliest and hardest by climate change. We're talking about elderly people. We're talking about poor people, communities of color. There's a really great example in California, over the last few weeks, and that stems from some of the wildfires here that I think we may be talking about in a bit. But during the periods of absolutely terrible air quality, when the air was really toxic, and many families were being told to stay in their homes all day long and not to open their windows, our farm workers didn't have a choice. Many of them are migrants, many of them are people of color, they're poor, and they were out in the fields every day having to pick our food in that air. That's just one important but small example of the way that climate change really harms the most vulnerable communities. And that's not just true in the United States, it's true internationally. In the past, I've worked with small island developing states. These are really small countries with small GDPs that are not in any way responsible for the problem of climate change, and they're really facing terrible effects of rising seas. up to and including the potential loss of their countries. And so this is a dynamic, as Jillian says, that really drives people to vote in those communities. She's right that the polling is that those communities include some of the most passionate supporters of strong climate action, and for good reason. And it's part, I think, of why we're starting to see folks in the environmental space and in the Democratic Party think about justice seriously when they put together their climate plans.
Cara, sticking with you. Oh, Jillian, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to kind of make a distinction here, because when we talk about climate change, it is a global issue. It is a planetary scale issue. But then there's another discussion of climate change that is more focused on these communities that we've been discussing, which involves pollution and the actual, like the water you drink and the air you breathe. And these are, whereas climate change on a global scale is much more difficult for any one president to influence, these kinds of local scale changes are going to be something that are very much within the next president's control. Even when we're talking about the court, that confirmation may well happen before election day. So either Biden or Trump, would be dealing with the same court, but these more local actions that really affect the way people are going to be interacting with their climate and the climate that they are going to have at home, again, are going to be, are still very much in play.
And you both mentioned the impact of the wildfires on not only these communities, but also the outcome of this election. Can we hear from you, Jillian, about how both candidates have responded to these fires and how that might impact voters on election day?
I mean, you see the very clear distinction, President Trump, who has never been, let's say, an activist in favor of addressing climate change, talking again about forest management, whereas you have Biden acknowledging that this is inextricably linked to climate change. You can't talk about these fires without talking about climate change. And it really has underlined the stark differences between these two candidates when it comes to even just the fundamental acknowledgement of climate change, let alone the policies for what we intend to do about it.
And Cara, something that we spoke about in preparation for this interview was just what it's like to sort of cover these issues while we have a president who is maybe casting doubt about the truth surrounding climate change. Can you talk about what that experience has been like for you personally?
Sure. I live in California, and like so many of my colleagues, neighbors, community members, we've now lived through a really tragic month of wildfires that have been unprecedented in scale. Just this morning, we got news that one of our wildfires has now reached 1 million acres in size, which is a mind-blowing number. We've now burned up more than 4 million acres in the state, which is size larger than the state of Connecticut. You can just imagine if something on the scale was happening on the East Coast, what kind of attention it would be getting from our national lawmakers. And it's not just the fires. We've all been living with incredibly poor air quality, as I said, that have kept families indoors, afraid to send their kids outside, obscuring the sky and the sun. It's just unbelievable. And then in the face of all of this, in the midst of all of this, we have a presidential leader who comes and talks to our beleaguered, state leaders and says that he thinks the science doesn't know. It's hard to know what to do with that. I mean, it just doesn't reflect the facts. I'm friends with lots of climate scientists. They will clearly tell you the science does know. There are 2 times as many extreme fire days in California in the fall than there used to be because of climate change. It's clear climate change is making this worse. So to have, I'm a relatively mild-mannered law professor. I run a nonpartisan research institute at UCLA. I have lots of friends who I love and respect who are Republicans, but it's hard to know what to do when one political party continuously just buries its head in the sand on these important issues.
Jillian, what has that experience been like for you?
Just as Cara said, it's there is one side that acknowledges what is actually happening and one side that does not. And it's, it's simply the truth. And it's a difficult thing to wrap your head around as a journalist. And, all of journalism has been dealing with this for the last, since well before the 2016 election, the problems of misinformation and political misinformation, and those, political misinformation is not confined to one party. Like both sides are guilty of various untruths over the years, but the persistent failure of the Republican Party to acknowledge climate change, let alone pass responsible legislation to help us deal with it, either on a citizenry level within the U.S. And on an international level with the rest of the international community. You see the EU is blazing past us. China, I think it was 2 weeks ago, committed to going carbon neutral by 2060, which has huge geopolitical implications. So we're really behind on dealing with this.
One thing we've talked about quite a bit is Trump's response to climate change, but I also want to hear from both of you about Biden's plans to address the climate crisis. His proposal to take up the portions of the Green New Deal has alienated both some moderate right voters and some far left voters. Jillian, can you talk about that distinction and the challenges Biden has faced trying to get both groups to vote for him?
Sure. I mean, so far he's been reasonably successful in bringing two sides to the climate table that haven't traditionally been there at the same time. You have the climate activists and people who are arguing for aggressive energy transition policies and an aggressive net zero timeline. And on the other hand, you have unions which work on things like oil rigs and, at natural gas wells, and don't want to see their jobs go away because of aggressive climate policy. And the Biden plan, as you say, it's managed to upset people on either end of the spectrum by, committing to a net zero goal, but also not committing to things like banning fracking. Joe Biden has been very pro natural gas as a transition, as a bridge fuel is the term that's held over from the Obama years, to make sure that people are in jobs and that we have energy as we work to transition the United States to solar and wind and other renewable forms of energy. Whether or not that's necessary, I think a lot of climate scientists would say that we don't need natural gas as a bridge fuel, which is why they're upset. But it'll be really interesting if he is elected to see how that plays out. The plan is the most aggressive climate plan we've seen of any presidential candidate ever, Democrat or Republican. But that, of course, is a campaign, sales pitch. It's not policy yet, so there's a long way to go.
Cara, how have folks within the climate expert community reacted to Biden's plan?
Yeah, so just as Jillian says, it's clear Biden's trying to walk a pretty fine line, but to my view, and I think to the view of a lot of folks in my world, he's walked it fairly successfully. He incorporated significant elements of sort of the more left-leaning climate plans from camps like Warren's and Inslee's, and crafted a climate plan that includes significant mandates for getting to clean electricity and net zero carbon, clean electricity by 2035, which polls show voters are really in favor of, to do so in a way that creates lots of jobs, which is, of course, an important part of the conversation in any economy, but especially this one. It includes significant elements of public investment, over $2 trillion, and pays attention to those equity and justice questions we discussed earlier in the program. And so I think he's done a fairly good job bringing the kind of more left wing of the party along. And Jillian's right, this is the most aggressive climate plan we've seen from any Democratic major candidate ever. I think it's critically important to recognize the fundamental difference between the Biden camp and the Trump camp on these issues, which is that Biden takes this problem seriously, has pledged to retake the mantle of international leadership, and would be headed in, the right direction. Maybe not quickly enough, but at least, toward the right goal line, whereas Trump would, and most voters recognize that fundamental difference, even if they're not entirely on all four squares with Biden on every detail.
And before we wrap, I just want to ask both of you why you think this is the most important election ever, starting with you, Jillian. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, I get to go first. We were prepared that this would be a question that would to sound canned because it is. But the IPCC in 2018 gave us until 2050 to zero out our carbon emissions or face irreversible climate consequences. We have 30 years left to do that, and 4 is a big chunk when you're talking about 30 years. So the next 4 years will be, absolutely determinative of where we come out on that goal and where we come out as a planet.
Cara, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think of this less as a question of political science and more as a question of math. Like, do we want a stable climate? I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. What kind of world do I want them to live in? Do I want my communities to feel safe? Do I want my president to be protecting my public health as opposed to sort of enacting the wish list of the fossil fuel industry? These are the things that are at stake. And the next, 5 to 10 years will help us determine whether we reach those goals. I don't think it's, I don't really want to live in a world where we wait another 10 years to work on these issues, because it'll get more expensive and lots more people will suffer.
Jillian and Cara, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. For those of you watching, please continue to follow Bloomberg QuickTake on all social platforms wherever you get your news. And thank you so much again for making time to watch today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.